Okay, I think we're going to get started. I wanted to welcome everybody. My name is Siobhan Carroll, and I'll be your host for today's webinar, which is on NIST adoption for healthcare. Thanks for joining us. Before we get started, I wanted to cover some quick housekeeping tips. Throughout the webinar, we'll keep all lines muted to prevent background sounds. If you need to get in touch with me, please use the chat feature, which is accessible by clicking the chat button that shows up on the bottom, middle, or right side of your screen if you move your mouse there. If you have questions that you'd like the presenters to address, please chat them to me whenever you think of them, and Vikas and Scott will answer them at the end, or actually during it, depending. After today's session, you'll receive an email from us, and if you're interested in a copy of the slides, let us know. The webinar itself will take about 45 minutes, and we'll leave a few minutes at the end for the Q&A. With that, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about today's presenters, Vikas Khosla and Scott Matilla. Vikas is Intraprise Health's Chief Digital Health Security Officer. He works closely with CISOs and CIOs to advance organization-specific and industry-wide cybersecurity, privacy, and compliance capabilities through the implementation of standards-based risk management programs and platforms. He was formerly the president and CEO of Blueprint Health Information Technology and has worked in healthcare since 1999. In 2008, building on his knowledge of health system, payer, and business associate workflows, Vikas and Blueprint introduced a suite of software products and NIST-based professional services supporting security, privacy, and compliance and health data management. Vikas frequently speaks on healthcare technology and cybersecurity issues with a focus on building holistic, framework-based risk management programs. Our very special guest today is Scott Matilla. Scott is the owner of M4 Solutions and has worked in the information technology and healthcare sector for over 14 years. In that time, he has helped several integrated healthcare organizations meet their strategic goals. This includes the development of sustainable programs to continue to meet their compliance, regulatory, security, and IT objectives. For the last 3 years, Scott has also been an adjunct professor and sits on the Dean's Advisory Board member at Duquesne University's Rango School of Health Sciences. Scott has also supported organizations in conducting the NIST CSF assessments as a third-party assessor, self-assessor, and strategic executive advisor. Vikas, why don't you take it from here?
Thank you so much, Siobhan. And Scott, great to be with you here today. I'm looking forward to a great conversation about a really, really relevant topic, as we'll delve into in a second. But first, maybe we'll just cover the agenda for the rest of the audience so they kind of see the flow of how we're going to go through this presentation. A little quick note about Enterprise Health. As I like to say, we are a team of healthcare, 100% healthcare focused, cybersecurity, privacy, compliance ninjas, and we're supported and have a set of point solutions related to various areas of risk management that are very relevant for our healthcare customers, including HIPAA, NIST, third-party risk management, integrated risk management. And we're certainly going to be touching on some of these themes here today. So if you have any questions about us or interest in connecting with us, please feel free to do so. In terms of our agenda for today, Scott really is a deep subject matter expert in the area of NIST, having worked with many organizations on very broad and complex, as well as regulatory requirement programs. So we're going to have him cover what cybersecurity framework, NIST Cybersecurity Framework is all about, as well as go deep into certain areas where organizations we know are looking to really advance and mature their programs. I think you'll learn a lot from Scott as he covers the framework, the path forward for organizations, and how to potentially present a phased approach to a NIST program. And I'll present a little bit at the end on our NIST platform, which could be a potential useful tool for organizations as they look to manage their program through a software product as well. So with that, let's set a little bit of context before I hand it over to Scott as to why we think this is really a relevant topic right now. As we've seen over the last 2 years, there have been significant tailwinds from the federal level around both compliance, but also cybersecurity, more and more so. They've passed various safe harbors and amendments to traditional HIPAA and HIPAA security and privacy rules that have really tried to get the community to work together in a more seamless fashion, while also signaling the importance of this particular topic, especially to healthcare. And as we're going to talk about at the end, Scott and I are going to have a little chat as after he presents his information about the most recent law that was enacted, and a lot of you may have heard of it, the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act that was just passed a couple weeks ago. And that act requires that critical infrastructure organizations, healthcare being a part of critical infrastructure, report security incidents and ransomware payments to CISA within a particular time frame, 72 and 24 hours respectively. This is really a very significant new law, and again, a strong signal from the federal level of how important it is that healthcare and healthcare organizations really work to develop holistic risk management and threat management programs. So as a backdrop for all of that, and I know we have a lot of content to get to, I'll move this forward and hand it over to Scott to cover some of the topics that we talked about in the agenda, starting with cybersecurity framework.
Thanks, Vikas. I'm glad to be here, and Siobhan, thank you for the introductions. So we're going to kind of run this into, I'll do a brief overview of the NIST CSF, and for some that are familiar with it and some may not be, but I always like to start at the beginning. So what is NIST? And I call it the risk-informed and flexible model. The NIST CSF is a top-down, bottom-up approach. The framework itself puts forth a set of recommendations and standards that are there to enable organizations to be better prepared in identifying, detecting their cyber attacks, and also provides guidelines on how detecting cyber attacks, and provides those guidelines on how to respond, prevent, and recover from cyber incidents. I always say, if you look at the framework itself, there are 23 categories, or there's 5 core categories, 23 categories, and there's 108 subcategories, and they are written to identify those activities within a cyber program that they should do and outcomes they should seek. It's not a checklist, it is not prescriptive, but there are implementation tiers, and we're going to discuss this here in more detail shortly. There's tier 1, which is partial, tier 2, which is risk informed, tier 3, which is repeatable, and tier 4, that is adaptive. And remember, security is not a destination, it's a way of life. So let's talk a little bit about the path forward. What should I consider as an organization? So now what? We are talking about doing the NIST CSF, or maybe we've done an assessment, or we've gotten a baseline. What do we do next? So we want to think about creating your assessment strategy, and we're going to talk about that here shortly in some more detail. Determining your path forward. Where do you want to go? Where do you want to be? Can we do this internally as a self-assessment? Do we have the skills, the capability, the demand and capacity, which is a critical aspect given the current budget constraints that a lot of us face? And then maybe it's hiring a third-party external assessor. Is that cost effective? And then potentially that hybrid approach. And Vikas and I are going to talk on this a little bit more in detail here shortly. The next is setting your goals, and what I call your poem, right? So you're not writing a poem, but you're creating a poem. So that's a plan of actions and milestones to achieve your desired level of maturity within your organization. And one thing I always want to say is we all may want to be a 4. We want to be that tier 4 where we're adaptive, but is that truly reality? And selecting a maturity model for your organization that fits. And promoting awareness for your program, goals, outcomes, and metrics for success and benefits to the organization overall. So let's talk about the assessment types and options that you have available to yourself. Option 1, as I talked about, is that internal self-assessment approach. You're defining the approach and methodology for how you're going to achieve your success, right? Looking at the methodology. How are you going to get the documentation needed? Do you have internal controls already? Is there potential alignment opportunity between the NIST CSF requirements and your internal controls that you've adopted? Always consider the guidance from an experienced NIST expert or assessor for your first internal assessment. No, you don't have to go this alone. There's plenty of expertise in this field and accessible sources to include with Intraprise Health. Opportunities to align your current internally adopted framework to achieve what I call that test one, cover many approach, right? Reducing that audit fatigue. And then consider your team's capacity and capabilities. Do we have the skill sets that are in existence or that we need to be successful with this self-assessment approach? And then the tools and necessary resources to help you along your journey. So let's look at option two. Option two is that third-party external assessment approach. I've been in that space myself as well, but this might be the path of least resistance. You're going to engage or potentially re-engage a prior assessor or identify a qualified assessor organization that can meet your objectives and your timelines. And I always say is look for somebody that has that expertise in NIST and the level of stringency in their validation procedures. It's not about, yes, we can get it done, we can hire that third party, but we want to make sure that they're giving us the necessary details and information to equip us to better understand our current baseline and where you want to go in the future. And the third option is the hybrid approach. It's a combination of both 1 and 2, primarily using that self-assessment approach, but also looking at scoping and the methodology reviewed in partnership with your external assessor prior to that self-assessment. And the external assessor will validate that assessment responses and findings to provide you that report that's of their evaluations of your self-assessment. Again, giving you that intel and information that's going to better equip you for future success if you continue in the hybrid approach, or again, for that externally validated assessment. And Vikas, do you want to talk a little bit more on this approach?
Sure. Yeah, Scott, I think that, one of the reasons we're pointing these three approaches out is that for those organizations, I'm sure there's folks on that have already started their self-assessment or already into trying to mature their program, and those that have not done that yet and that are new to frameworks and cybersecurity framework adoption. I think we all know that this is a pretty significant and heavy lift. And it's pretty rare for organizations to be able to sort of self-serve 100% in terms of their entire journey, which is, we know is a multi-year journey, is really an ongoing adoption exercise. So the ability to use one of these components and the ability to leverage NIST experts, as Scott has mentioned out there, I think is very valuable. And whether you're doing it through education, webinars and other things like this, or you're actually bringing somebody else in, it's always helpful to get that external perspective on what you're doing because of the non-prescriptive nature of the way you apply the CSF. Having that dialogue with a trusted partner of yours could be really, really valuable. And quite honestly, most organizations that we see often go through a mix and match of these different options based on various things like budgets, where they're at in their maturity life cycle, their goals and their objectives. So it's not unusual for people to bring in a third party for that very first assessment, but then maybe use more of a hybrid approach in year 2, and then potentially even a self approach in year 3, and then continually cycle through some combination of these approaches. So it's certainly not one approach or one option forever. You can combine and mix and kind of get the best of all worlds, if you will, over a multi-year program view. So having that roadmap around how you're going to approach your program development is really important, and then aligning those resources and partners up, I think is a smart way to approach it.
Agreed, Vikas. And I think it's just like, if you're starting a fitness program, you're not going to jump right in. You're going to look for somebody there to assist you. You're going to hire a personal trainer that's going to help you kind of develop your plan and meet those objectives to be cyber fit. So I think that third approach, as you're getting started, is a fantastic way to look at it. All right. So that's we're going to move over to the phased approach now, and this is kind of where I'm going to talk more in detail about the tiers of implementation, but also going into structuring out that phased plan and some things you should consider. Again, these are not prescriptive, it's just considerations as you're going through your journey with your team or your external assessor to take into consideration. So let's look at those tiers of implementation. And we talked about tier 1, that partial. That kind of sets the tone of, well, it's ineffective risk management methodologies. We may have unsystemic risk management processes, unreliable risk management programs, unresponsive risk management participation. It's more or less not saying that you don't have something in place, but again, you're kind of at that bottom level. To moving to the next step in tier 2. You're kind of a risk-informed organization that has, some informal risk management methods. It's there, but it's not formalized yet. Maybe it not be documented. You have unfinished risk management processes and potentially underdeveloped risk management programs, or that incomplete risk management participation from the top down or the bottom up, right? It's not really in the DNA of the organization. I'm going to tell you, at tier 2, I'm actually commonly, I see this with many of the organizations I collaborate with or advise, is a lot of them are generally in between that tier 1 and tier 2 space. But now we're talking about moving beyond that. How do we get beyond that, basement level, that first floor? We really want to get to tier 3. It's moving to repeatable, where you're structured, it's robust, orderly, routine risk management participation across the executive level and even throughout the organization. That's moving and increasing your level of stringency and maturity. To tier 4, that top level. Again, everybody wants to be a 4. We talk about that, right? But is it realistic? In some organizations, it is. It's adaptive. You've got that risk DNA and culture that has adopted those. But adaptive, you're looking at, the adaptive risk management. It's dynamic, it's responsive, and you have interactive risk management participation across the board, from the board level to the CEO to your key partners throughout the organization, and folks that understand what are our risks, what are we discussing. So now we understand where our tiers of implementation are at. I want to talk more about taking that phased approach to your assessment strategy. Again, this is not prescriptive, but suggestions on how do we start moving up to that level of 3 or 4, depending on where you're currently at. So at the first phase, I call this the gut check. Where are we most vulnerable? From a scan perspective to risks, maybe we have a risk register, formal or informal. Understanding what your current state is and really looking at what controls do we have, what data do we maintain, and critically, who has got access to those systems and that information. Identifying and kind of prioritizing those risk treatment efforts. You're doing that introspection, you're thinking, okay, how do I need to do this? And then ultimately thinking about how to identify those potential budget needs. As we're looking at forecasting from a strategic perspective, is what am I going to need? How is this going to help me move forward? Really understanding that baseline and what your future state is. What do I vision? What do I see my security organization or my technology organization looking like? And then one of the biggest challenges that we always see, but it's good to understand what risks currently exist, and ultimately what is the organization's risk appetite. Now we move to phase 2, and I've said this before. For some of you, I'm going to show my age. It's SNL. It's Jack Handy, Deep Thoughts with Jack Handy. But we're going to do some deep introspection. Again, where do you really want to be as a security organization? Think about that. Do I want to be a 2.5 this year, or am I trying to get to a 3? Do I want to be a 3.5? How do I really get to that 4? Laying out that journey, those milestones. How are you going to achieve this? Is it going to take adoption? Is there culture change? Is there sponsorship needs? How can we align this to our current framework? Taking a look and saying, okay, does this make sense? Can we align it to, maybe we're using the high trust CSF or COSO or CIS? And do we have the adoption and support from the top down, bottom up? Those change Sherpas, those sponsors that are going to really speak to why we're doing this and why it's important to us as an organization. And then thinking about the culture needle. Do we need to move that culture needle? That's always a challenge. And I'm going to tell you, it's not easy. It's going to take time, but it's possible. And do we have the necessary staff to support the requirements and functions that are needed for us to be successful and to truly mature the program overall? So now you've done those deep thoughts, deep introspection. Now you're going to move into what I talked about earlier, is that poem, right? You're crafting out the future. So you want to create a plan that is measurable and actionable to appropriately treat those risks and vulnerabilities. How are you going to overcome and hold those teams accountable as you're creating that poem, right? How do we know that they're going to deliver? How do we make sure that they continue to measure and ensure that the controls and the requirements are operating effectively? And one thing I always say is create a space to have and identify lessons learned. I think we've come to a point, and especially in security, is we need to create that open space internally. Yes, there are risks, but lessons learned, right? How do we grow from that? And I think that moves you to a higher level of maturity as an organization. And then that phase 4, right? We've done our poem, we've gut checked, we've had some late nights of deep introspection, and now we're moving into phase 4. We're breathing. We're going to start implementing. We're going to start measuring and managing. We're going to want to create a repeatable environment. And that includes the opportunity to create that space of continuous improvement in your controls and your requirements. Those CSI projects, right? And then the opportunity to look at monitoring and automation, leveraging that security technology stack, bringing those together. Look for those areas that you can truly start to harness and measure and potentially implement what we're going to talk about next, which is what should we measure? So the first thing that I always recommend, and some say, oh, well, it's PPT, is it PPI? You know, I still think as we're looking at the requirement, there's not truly a prescriptive way given by NIST on how we should measure. But this is what I'm recommending, is always have a policy. Yes, paper is there. I don't say paper is a defense mechanism, but at least it sets the tone. And I always say, know the way, show the way, go the way. But with a policy, do you have a policy that clearly articulates how that requirement is going to be held accountable to the teams? Is it formally published, communicated, and accessible? Do we have a central repository where I know that my teams can go and say, hey, I can communicate this to you. You can go and look for it here. Or if somebody's doing R&D, they can quickly access that information so they know the guide rails. And is it reviewed and updated regularly? I see this constantly where policies sit stagnant. They're not changed. They're not following the path and the growth and the maturity of the program. So something to think about. How can you measure that? Then you move into procedures, processes, and standards. Another area that we know is a challenge, right? Documenting what we do day to day. And I always say this is something that is critical no matter what. Is if I won the lottery today, I want to ensure that my team is always set up for success and has the information they need to move forward. So is it, again, formally documented? Does it clearly articulate the who, what, when, where, and why? How are we managing this? Who's doing it? Hey, maybe we have some handoffs, but it's great to have that documented there. And are those responsibilities outlined? And again, is it formally communicated, understood, and regularly reviewed and updated? Is it repeatable? Is it measurable? To moving to that implementation state, looking at each requirement, can you really demonstrate this through tangible operating evidence? Can you replicate or attest to that is truly functioning? Via screenshots, reports, metrics, populations. Again, and most importantly, can your stakeholders clearly communicate how they achieve this requirement and outcome? And that we see this sometimes as people get nervous in front of assessors and auditors. Don't be. Talk about how you do your job, but again, that's going to be founded by your processes and standards and should be measured. And then metrics and KPIs. One thing I've learned in my career, and a CISO I worked for always said, outcomes over activities. That has always resonated with me in my career. But how are we truly going to measure our successes? Vikas, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about this as well, but looking at the recommendations here.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we can sort of draw this out. But, Scott's talked a lot about the what we should be measuring. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the how. How do we measure these things? And certainly not everything here or not everything on this list are things that maybe you want to do right out of the bat or can do right out of the bat. But think of this as you achieve greater levels of maturity, you're probably going to have more and more metrics and measurements that you'll want to convey as well. We're all business professionals, and as business professionals, we are held to a certain standard, and certain numerical outcomes, as Scott has mentioned, are really important in terms of communication and communicating the progress of what we're doing and our program, and continuing to give the organization confidence that we're on the right trajectory, the right path to greater levels of maturity. So some of the things that I've worked with, clients on that we've had a very collaborative way to engage. So I'll cover some of these topics. Is at the basic level, I think we all understand after an assessment is done, we're going to get our gaps, we're going to get our findings. So identifying and being transparent with what our gaps and findings are is going to be important. So numerically, from a metric standpoint, what are the number of gaps and findings that we have? But just as importantly, and if you're going to just do these two, identify the things that you've remediated, right? So those are the wins. So we know what our gaps are, but we also, over a certain period of time, have remediated certain gaps. So I always say, take a little time in between the completion of the assessment to then present findings, because you want to be able to present those remediation activities. And it's really interesting, oftentimes, as we're going through an assessment, there is this sort of parallel remediation effort going on too, especially if something is critical that we have found, or something's easy, or something's in progress. So findings and remediation, I think, are fundamental. Adoption scores, so we talked, Scott talked a lot about what level do we want to be at. So that could be a measurement that you're presenting year over year as well. And I know a lot of CISOs do that, whether it's internally to their teams or externally to executive and board levels, is where are we today, what are our goals, and what are we doing to get there? So the adoption score could be a good metric to convey that. And maturity level objectives, kind of wrapped up in the adoption score, and is this maturity level objectives is another way to indicate that greater and growing level of adoption. A couple of interesting things for people to consider. Recently NIST released a ransomware prevention profile white paper, and within that they identify a discrete set of controls that they believe map towards a healthy ransomware prevention posture. So I've been having a lot of conversations recently with CISOs about leveraging that, because ransomware is such a top of mind topic, such an important, critical topic these days, to leverage that white paper and the methodology within it, the controls within it, to maybe come up with a profile that matches your organization, and then maybe be able to score against that in some way, create some metrics around that. I think that's a sort of a very current, very relevant, progressive way to think about your program. And then budgeting. We all have, more and more there's been all these stats out there, we can all find them, about the increased level of budgeting for security programs. And speaking to that to some degree relative to what do you need for remediation activities, how effective have they been, looking at some of these other metrics that have been listed here, can be really informative, especially to the C-suite and to boards as well, so that they know that their money is being well spent and progressing the organization forward. So some food for thought here for folks to think about. Certainly not a finite list. There are going to be probably many other things that you can come up with that are relevant to your organization, or that you find, sort of through other sources as well. But metrics and KPIs, I think, really, really important to be able to objectively and transparently, I think just as important, convey the progress and the investments you're making in your program.
Agreed. Measure your success, right?
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Vikas. Appreciate that. All right, so let's kind of move to the next, and I'm not going to go through this in very detail, but this is what I call the scoring checklist. And I'm going to bring up all of the 4 tiers here. from a checklist perspective. And, you know, in general, the aim is for the organization to move from what we call that informal process, which are widely deployed in their businesses, to a culture of good cyber hygiene practices that are supported by that formalized and adaptable process. This is a way to create an accurate description of how your current and target risk management practices and how you may wish them to continue to mature, from the lowest tier at tier 1 to the highest tier at tier 4 adaptive. The important thing is to accurately describe your current practices and really understand, what does that mean? Where do I want to be from a target perspective with my risk management practices? And the difference between your current risk profile and future. We don't know what's going to happen. Risk is a risk, but and I'm not going to spend time talking about risk as its definition, because everybody has their own take on it, which I completely understand. But you want to think about, where am I going? And as you're looking through your checklist, is okay, maybe I know we have one component of this, so I score myself here. So 1 through 4, I scored 4 through all the partial. Now I'm going to move to my risk-informed state. We have some risk management practices, they're documented, but they're not organizational wide. Okay, so we know we may score half or full on that one. Moving down to interaction with other external organizations from a cybersecurity risk perspective. And then, do we have the policies and procedures to really support that risk-informed state? So kind of scoring yourself through that to repeatable, right? We receive information from external entities. We have a good understanding, adoption, and communication of our cybersecurity risk practices to that adaptive state. And I love this one. We have multiple ways of sharing our information to external organizations. Our risk management is part of our culture and DNA, and it's all supported by policy, process, and implementation. So looking at that 0 to 4 scale, where are you currently at and where do you want to be? And remember, it's not a finite number and it's not prescriptive. NIST does not provide this prescription of it's exactly going to be a 1 or it's exactly a 2. Maybe I want to be that 3.5. So think about how to utilize this to potentially measure as you're creating that poem. So where do we start? Again, where are we most vulnerable? An example at this subcategory level, and I'm going to use this one, is asset management, right? It's looking at, under IDAM 03, looking at the communication and data flows that are mapped, going back to documentation. So this enforces the approved authorization for controlling the flow of information within our systems. We commonly employ flow control policies and enforcement mechanisms to control the flow of information. So how are we documenting that? And it also helps us, and then kind of going back to what Vikas was talking about, the ransomware profile, this one ensuring that potentially it's implemented is reducing the risk that an attacker could laterally move within the organization. So you have some understanding of where things are documented. So for each area where your vulnerabilities may exist, understand the cost to remediate those. And consider what those various system attributes that would increase that likelihood or impact if the vulnerability would be exploited. You want to prioritize those efforts based on time, cost increase, and maturity and risk reduction, going back to that appetite. Where are we really trying to be and where do we want to go and where should we prioritize our investments? And think about, how long is it going to take to remediate or implement? Are we seeing any resistive strength increases or reduction in risk? Gauge the level of effort that's required and potential technology needs that are there to support it, right? And we all have a fantastic, sometimes I see various technology stacks, but there is opportunity to utilize the current security technology stack that you have and tools to assist and decrease the potential cost needs. And then how do we determine how to approach the requirement to address the risk and gap? And I always call this Sprechen NIST, or Sprechen the compliance language, but as you look at the NIST CSF, it aligns to other frameworks as well, like COVID and ISO and NIST SP 853 Rev 4, where there are recommendations for implementation. So utilize those resources and know they align to other frameworks just as much. So now we've talked about where we are, where we're going, and kind of where you want to be. So let's talk about how do we really get this into our program and program alignment. So evolving the NIST CSF into your program from what I call that decentralized state and manual requirements to a centralized with repeatable state is going to be one of your key challenges and opportunities as well. That's reducing time and effort, but also increasing awareness and metrics. But aligning the NIST requirements to your current control framework will require a little bit of that effort up front. But I will tell you, based on my experience and working with other colleagues, is it will pay dividends in the long term. And requirements and controls should be evaluated on whether they are in place, reduce risk, provide necessary resistive strength, manage, and provide that monitoring capability. Focus on the effectiveness of the requirement. Think about it again, as you're going through this, think about, are they effective? Does the design, from a design perspective, does our current control design meet the effectiveness of the requirement? Maybe it already does, or maybe you have to take in new considerations. And is it operating? Are the outcomes what we expected them to be based on the way that our controls and requirements are designed within our current organization? So I'm going to hand this over to Vikas now. He's going to talk a little bit about the NIST risk management framework and go from there.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, so I know we've given everybody a lot to think about and consider, so I'll just pile on and give you another thing to think about and consider as you're either starting up or maturing your program, which is the RMF 2.0, the Risk Management Framework 2.0 that was released not too long ago. I think this is something that as you're working on your security program and framework adoption, that you really should consider, because I think what the great point about what NIST did with 2.0 is how they brought together 3 areas that are really relevant to every organization. So bringing together security risk management with privacy, along with now supply chain, and within one process around the RMF, I think is tailor-made for today's environment. So whether you can take this on or not, I really think organizations should think about, read up on the RMF. You know, there's a lot of information out there on the NIST website where you can get more educated about NIST. But one of the great things about it is that it really speaks to enterprise-wide risk management. By bringing those 3 components together, we can really see a vision for how this applies across the entire organization and beyond just the information technology or the information security team or box, you know, as we call it here. It really gets outside those dotted lines, if you will, to really look at the entire organization end to end and is holistic in nature, which is something near and dear to my heart. And so, and it further can foster your CSF adoption if you are aligning that effort along with the RMF. And as Ron Ross from NIST, you know, states here in terms of why they did what they did and what the benefits of it are, I think it just makes a lot of sense if you're going to put the time, effort, and energy into thinking about cybersecurity frameworks, to think about the risk management process that coincides and is so important to sort of, you know, implement together, especially for those organizations that are looking to get into, you know, tier 3, tier 4 levels of maturity. So with that, Scott, I don't know if you had any other comments on RMF, but if not, I was going to give the folks a little bit of an overview of a way to bring this all together on a software platform.
Now let's go.
All right, sounds good. So, so as I mentioned before in the opening, Enterprise Health has point solutions in the risk management space. That's the area that we really live in. One of those is our NIST framework platform. And Scott, if we can go to the next screen. What the platform itself is meant to do is really bring together a centralized, to provide a centralized tool, a centralized platform as you're working on your program, to bring all of those components together, from the documentation that's involved, the controls and where you're at relative to controls and control maturity, all the way on to managing the program. And it kind of starts with a walkthrough, a workflow, you know, wizard-based driven view of doing your assessment, looking at your locations, looking at your systems, doing the actual interviews and the assessing of your program, and then moving forward towards remediation, and then ultimately that final state of that plan that can be presented as far as a one-click reporting capability on the platform. Scott, let's go to the next screen. And this screen, I think, just gives you a sense of sort of how intuitive, sort of simple it is to use that particular platform. But some of the things that are nice about it is that we also provide those informative references, not only to NIST, but also how it aligns with HIPAA, ISO, COBIT, and CIS, as you can see here as well. Another nice feature, and it goes back to a lot of what we talked about, is the target maturity level. Where do we want to be? So by going through the assessment online, you'll get a score of where you are today, but you can also identify where do you want to be going forward. So what we're trying to do is get out of all those spreadsheets and Word documents and all those other different types of tools that are sort of disseminated and fragmented out there, and get everybody onto a centralized platform that brings all of this together. And I love, quite honestly, from my perspective, the ability to sort of do it once and use it multiple times. And Scott hit on that before, that really should be one of our desired outcomes. And the ability to attach your supporting evidence, policies, procedures along with each one of the controls that are in scope with you, I think becomes really powerful as well. Scott, let's go to the next screen. And this just gives you a sense of also, as I mentioned before, once you've done your assessment, it automatically creates a remediation planning resource for you here, where you can use on an ongoing basis to track your remediation efforts, provide sort of responsibility to different owners, even indicate certain timelines and dates within which you want to achieve or remediate a particular finding. Scott, let's go to the next screen. And then one of the other great features about it is that after that's all done, we can map this to CIS and CMMC. So if you're looking to align yourself to a maturity model, this is a great way to have that automatically done through the course of the work that you're doing through the assessment process. It automatically, algorithmically gives you relative to your current state against those maturity models and maturity levels. Scott, we'll go to the next screen. And then really finally, as we mentioned here, there's a nice capability to provide different types of reporting through the platform in an automated fashion. It's a very comprehensive final state report, but also if you need to present to executive teams or boards, you can unselect all of the detail and just provide executive summaries. Or if you're looking for all the detail and there are different aspects of it, you can pick and choose just by clicking the checkbox here, the types of things that you want included in your report. The important, I think, thing for folks, the benefits, is that when you do this through the first time, whether you're starting it for the first time or you already got a program and then you kind of have the answers already lined up, what we have seen is that it reduces the effort in year 2 and then subsequent years significantly. In year 2 of using the platform to manage your program, the effort reduction is almost about 50%. And then we expect to see incremental gains in terms of efficiencies going forward too. So not only is it a way to centralize everything, but it's also it's a scalable way to manage your program and continue to do your assessments, whether you're mandated to do it or you do it as part of your program on an annual basis. So some capabilities in here again to bring it together, and it's all supported by 3 different models of how we provide the service, which is a self-assessment for those organizations that are doing it on their own. They can use that mode, and it's just a software license that they purchase. But facilitated would be that kind of hybrid approach we talked about earlier, where you're doing it, but we have our security team, our NIST experts, working with you, validating the information that you're putting in, having consultations with you, and especially when it comes to the final state assessment and maturity models. And then the managed services is really where you're really looking for that third-party external assessment and management of potentially management of the program, but certainly that assessment where we really take the lead in terms of coming in as a third party, using the platform as well as our consultants to run you through the entire assessment process from beginning to end. So 3 different ways that you can utilize it. So if there is interest, we'll have a poll question later on. Those that are interested can certainly reach out to us. Scott, let's go to the next Yeah, so resources here. I don't know if you want to mention anything. We know that certain folks are going to want the deck, so we wanted to provide certain links to things that might be helpful as you further look into your program.
Yeah, I just would say if you haven't looked at the NIST IR 8374, that ransomware profile, I would suggest taking a look at it. It's great information to utilize as part of your program.
Absolutely. Yep. Did want to mention one other thing is that a lot of the information that we provided here, and certainly different aspects of it as well, are captured in a recent ebook that Enterprise Health developed with Healthcare IT Today. If you haven't downloaded it, I would really recommend that you do it. It's free, but it's a very comprehensive way to think about implementation, adoption, budgeting, communication, all the concepts that Scott really talked about to get to really that adaptive level, if you will. So free guide out there that we put together, hopefully as a resource to folks that are looking to implement their NIST program.
All right. So final thoughts and recommendations, the best part, right? So these are from my perspective, and again, just based on some of the clients that I've worked with and executives, is really determine where you want to be as a security organization. Set a measurable plan to truly achieve it. Going back to that poem, how are you going to do it? How are you going to get there? Know the way, show the way, go the way. And find ways to, again, cross map, reduce efforts, reduce that audit fatigue, and leverage publicly accessible guidance and recommendations, as well as resources and organizations like Enterprise Health. They're a fantastic way to partner and build how you want to achieve and get through your journey to that desired level of maturity state. And again, hold teams accountable. I know we're all professionals here, but again, holding those teams accountable to truly deliver and manage their cyber defenses is going to be critical as you go through the next year, 2 years, or 3 years. And with the constant changes going across many organizations, your maturity tier may dip. It's not a constant, right? The cyber threat landscape changes every day. So be prepared to have those conversations with the leadership and board. And then cybersecurity risk management is everybody's responsibility. I always say, from the janitor to the board, everybody is responsible. And be realistic. Being a 4 is great, but does it truly represent the defenses in place within the organization? Vikas, anything from your side?
No, I think we've covered a lot of good content here. Know that you're fighting a good fight, and we're here with you, and hopefully we'll be a great resource to you as you continue to implement your program. But it's doable. It's an emotional journey sometimes, but certainly one that's necessary and critical in today's environment.
Completely agree. All right. Well, I thank you, and I really appreciate and glad to be here and speaking to everybody today. And please don't hesitate to let me know if there's anything you have or any questions.
All right, sounds good. And we're going to do a quick little poll question here. So if you would like to learn more about our NIST platform or our NIST services, or just connect with us, just answer yes. And if you want to be touched sort of later, you can do maybe later. Otherwise, you can say no. So we'll leave this open for a couple of seconds. Now, we will be, Scott and I think, are really going to talk a little bit about, I mentioned it earlier, in terms of the recent legislation passed around the cyber incident reporting requirements. So we're gonna talk about that a little bit right after this poll is done. And I think let's leave it open for 10 more seconds, and then we will close it out. All right, terrific. So Scott, as we talked about earlier, the implementing a cybersecurity program and framework is really so important. We know, as I like to say, pick a framework, any framework, but pick a framework. And the recent legislation that was passed, really, I think it was last week, where critical infrastructure organizations, healthcare obviously being a part of that, have to report their incidents and any ransomware payments to CISA. I think that, to me, was really a sounding of the bell like we haven't seen before. So I'd love to get some thoughts from you as to how organizations should really think about incorporating all the different regulations that we covered earlier, as well as the recent legislation. How does that tie into their, whether it's from a governance standpoint or whether it's actually from an implementation standpoint? What are some of the ways that they can be better prepared to meet these requirements coming from the federal government relative to their NIST program? Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a little bit of everything, right? It's a little bit of governance. It's a little bit of how is that going to fit within the organization? And to that point, it's kind of like the track race. The gun has went off, and we look at the continued evolution and focus on security. The team, from a team perspective, as you're building your program, and some things that some of the folks on the call may have considered already is, looking at how are we monitoring, how are we collaborating with external entities and parties to ensure that maybe we need to change the way that we're responding to incidents, right? We're looking at the more aggressive time frame. How are we going to do that? Are we ready for it? And thinking about how is that going to play into your program's development, and do I need staff, or do I need to retrain or grow the current staffing that I have to take into consideration those capabilities as well. But even from a budgeting forecast, we know that there is more to come to think about how is that going to evolve in the next 12 months to 24 months, 36 months. Where are we going? We know that there is going to be that continued change as we head forward. So as you're building out that NIST CSF, or potentially using this as a foundation of your new program, taking in and looking at those considerations and having a way to monitor and engage and have those discussions to ensure that you're not behind the 8 ball, essentially, is going to be a key challenge for folks, but I think we can do it.
And it's interesting, lately I've been having a lot of conversations. We think about the heightened activity internationally and the threat of cyber attacks and cyber incidents to our infrastructure. Obviously, one of the impetuses behind that law, the ability to do effective tabletop exercises, simulations, that's really, really important too. And getting the whole organization involved in those types of exercises, we can only execute those effectively, the things that we practice. So I'm a strong believer that you have to practice, especially incident response. And for those organizations that maybe haven't convened command centers or incident response teams yet, I think looking at not only the law, but looking at the sort of international, sort of the landscape out there of threats that exist, today, to me, it just seems like it's a must do.
Agreed. Agreed. And I think that, and you bring up a great point, Vikas, about doing this tabletop exercises. I see a lot of organizations that only do them annually. I think a more frequent or potentially quarterly basis to run different scenarios and making sure that you have the right people at the table is going to set you up for longer term success and the ability to quickly respond. And it kind of goes back to, while having digital documentation out there, sometimes having that paper backup is always good too. We want to save trees, but practice makes perfect as well. Not saying there's always perfect in cybersecurity, but doing that more frequently, I think, would have a better impact on the organization and ensuring those people know their roles and responsibilities as well.
And I think it kind of goes to that adaptive nature, right? We're kind of talking about organizations that are probably tier 3 to tier 4 that can do sort of more focused, dynamic, on demand, if you will, whether it's assessments, whether it's tabletop exercises, but you start to see this profile of that tier 3, tier 4. And to your point before about adoption, it just becomes part of the DNA. It's not a forced activity. It is just sort of the way that we operate, and we're very dynamically responding to things that happen in the environment. So for those that may not be as mature, and you want sort of formulate a picture of what your organization might look like as it matures, that's probably what it looks like, is one that is really responsive to the, sort of whether it's 0-day, whether it's, cyber incident threats, whether it's alerts from CISA, that you have a way to process and act upon those things as well.
Agreed. Yeah, it's just like, phishing training. We do phishing campaigns. Organizations do it all the time, and even more so with spear phishing, but we're trained. Everybody's trained. And I think that is something else that we're going to continue to see a shift in progression in this space where, to your point, how do we get that into the DNA of everybody? How do we spread the good word? And I think training and information outside of the month of October would be fantastic to look at.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Well, we're going to give everybody a few minutes to get into their next meetings and transition. I've really enjoyed the conversation here today, Scott. Thank you so much for being our special guest today. Great information that you've shared with us. And if our audience has any questions, feel free to get in touch with us. And if you have any questions for Scott, you can send those in. We'll make sure we get those things answered as well. So thank you, everybody, for your time today. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll be connecting with you all soon.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.